By the time a military aircraft engine shows visible signs of failure, the outcome is usually already decided. Military jet engines are designed to operate with extraordinary tolerance for stress, vibration, heat, and environmental contamination. And because of that resilience, the earliest failure almost never appears dramatic or urgent. It does not arrive with alarms, flames, or sudden loss of thrust, and it rarely occurs during moments when crews expect danger, such as combat power settings or aggressive maneuvering. Instead, it begins as a deviation so small that it remains comfortably within accepted operating limits, blending into what engineers classify as normal variation. In a system built to tolerate imperfection, that tolerance becomes a hiding place, allowing small internal changes to persist unnoticed, while gradually reshaping how the engine behaves over time in ways that are invisible to both pilots and maintenance systems. The first meaningful problem almost always originates in the airflow path, rather than the combustion process, because airflow is the foundation upon which every other function inside a jet engine depends. Military engines rely on precisely shaped airflow to compress, heat, and expand gases in a controlled sequence, and even microscopic changes in that airflow can have cumulative effects across hundreds or thousands of flight hours. When airflow becomes slightly uneven due to gradual erosion, subtle compressor blade deformation, seal wear, or foreign object ingestion, too small to register as damage, the engine does not react violently or unpredictably. Instead, it compensates automatically. Fuel flow adjusts, pressure ratios remain nominal, exhaust temperatures stay within limits, and thrust output appears unchanged. From the cockpit, and from most diagnostic systems, nothing looks wrong. In reality, the engine has lost a portion of its safety margin, meaning it now has less capacity to absorb additional stress without instability, even though no single parameter indicates danger. As this imbalance persists across repeated flight cycles, the internal thermal environment of the engine begins to shift in ways that are difficult to detect through standard monitoring or inspection. Components designed to heat and cool evenly now experience asymmetric thermal loading as airflow subtly favors certain internal paths. Over time, this creates localized temperature gradients, particularly in turbine sections where materials already operate close to their design limits. These hotspots do not cause immediate failure or visible damage, but they accelerate fatigue and reduce long-term durability. Metal expands unevenly. Protective coatings degrade faster in specific regions, and internal clearances drift away from their original design values. Each change remains individually acceptable, yet together they quietly reshape how stress is distributed throughout the engine, reducing tolerance for future disturbances that would otherwise be harmless. Eventually, vibration becomes part of the system's behavior, though not in a way that immediately attracts attention. Rather than violent shaking or obvious instability, the engine develops harmonic oscillations that occur only under specific operating conditions. These vibrations may appear at certain throttle settings, altitude ranges, or temperature bands, making them intermittent and difficult to reproduce during routine testing. Because they are not constant, they often escape detection during scheduled maintenance or ground runs. Pilots rarely notice them, particularly in aircraft designed to isolate vibration from the cockpit. And even when subtle vibration is felt, it is often attributed to environmental factors, airframe resonance, or normal engine characteristics, rather than a developing internal imbalance. At this stage, the engine remains fully operational, but it is no longer behaving exactly as its designers intended. Maintenance systems are optimized to identify discrete faults rather than gradual systemic drift. Scheduled inspections, sensor thresholds, trend monitoring, and fault codes are extremely effective at detecting broken components, excessive wear, foreign object damage, or clear deviations from expected performance envelopes. They are far less effective at identifying cumulative imbalance that develops slowly over long operational timelines. When an engine begins drifting away from its original equilibrium, maintenance actions often address symptoms rather than causes. A worn component may be replaced, restoring one parameter while inadvertently increasing stress elsewhere. Over time, the engine accumulates a series of technically correct maintenance decisions that collectively move it further from its original design assumptions without ever triggering a decisive warning. At this point, engineering considerations begin to intersect with organizational realities. Military aviation operates under constant pressure to maintain readiness, sortie availability, and mission capability across entire fleets rather than individual airframes. Commanders and planners rely on aggregated readiness metrics, not subtle behavioral trends inside a single engine. If an engine meets performance requirements, produces no repeat fault codes, and passes inspection criteria, it remains in service. There is little incentive to remove an engine based on subtle behavioral drift that does not violate defined limits, particularly when operational demand is high and replacement capacity is constrained. This is not negligence. It is the logical outcome of managing complex systems at scale. The problem is that engines do not fail statistically. They fail physically, and physical failures often follow paths that statistics cannot reliably predict until recovery is no longer possible. This is typically where the first irreversible decision occurs. A minor anomaly is logged, categorized as non-critical, and accepted as normal variation. The aircraft returns to service without additional monitoring or restriction. Over weeks or months, the imbalance deepens incrementally, reinforced by every flight cycle. Each takeoff, climb, throttle change, cruise segment, and landing adds stress in the same direction, gradually exhausting the engine's ability to adapt. The system continues to compensate, masking its own deterioration until adaptive capacity is exhausted. When failure finally occurs, whether as compressor stall, turbine damage, blade liberation, or sudden power loss, it appears abrupt and unexpected, even though the underlying process began long before anyone believed there was a meaningful problem. As operational pressure continues, engines operating with reduced margin are often asked to perform roles that accelerate the problem rather than expose it. High-tempo flight schedules, repeated short sorties, rapid throttle transitions, and operation in challenging environments all add incremental stress to systems already drifting away from their original equilibrium. None of these demands are inherently unsafe when viewed individually. Combined, however, they compress timelines and reduce opportunities for subtle issues to be noticed. The engine adapts flight after flight, compensating internally while its ability to recover from additional disturbances steadily erodes. As engines continue operating under these conditions, the gradual loss of margin begins to influence decision-making in subtle but important ways. Flight crews rarely see a reason to treat the aircraft differently because performance remains within expected bounds. Maintenance teams continue to service the engine according to schedule, because inspection results do not justify deeper intervention. Commanders continue to assign missions because the aircraft remains available and reliable on paper. At no point does a single decision appear reckless or negligent. Each action is reasonable when viewed in isolation, yet together they allow a system that is quietly degrading to remain exposed to the same stresses that caused the degradation in the first place. Over time, the internal adaptations that once protected the engine begin to work against it. Control systems designed to smooth out irregularities compensate more aggressively as margin narrows, masking instability rather than revealing it. Thermal gradients become more pronounced, vibration modes sharpen, and tolerances that once absorbed variation begin to transmit stress instead. The engine still responds predictably, but the cost of that predictability is paid internally in material fatigue and structural strain that are invisible to normal monitoring. The system has not failed, but it has become brittle, losing the flexibility that once allowed it to recover gracefully from disturbance. If you find this kind of long-form analysis useful, subscribing helps the channel continue producing videos like this. Once margin is sufficiently reduced, failure no longer requires an extraordinary trigger. A routine throttle movement, a change in ambient conditions, or a standard power demand can be enough to push the engine beyond its remaining tolerance. Because the system has been compensating for so long, the transition from stable operation to failure appears sudden. To observers, the engine seems to move abruptly from healthy to broken. In reality, the transition is simply the point at which accumulated imbalance overwhelms the system's ability to adapt. The failure mode may vary, manifesting as compressor stall, turbine blade damage, bearing failure, or power loss. But the underlying cause remains the same. Margin was lost long before the final event occurred. When investigators reconstruct these events, they often encounter a paradox. The engine may show signs of damage consistent with a specific failure mode, yet no single maintenance action, operational decision, or design flaw fully explains why the failure occurred when it did. The timeline appears compressed, with little obvious warning before the event. This is because the most important part of the story happened quietly, far earlier than the moment investigators are trained to examine. The initial deviation that reduced margin rarely leaves a clear signature in post-failure analysis, making it difficult to identify without reconstructing long-term operational history. This difficulty has led to a recurring pattern in military aviation investigations, where conclusions focus on proximate causes rather than initiating conditions. Reports may emphasize component failure, environmental factors, or procedural deviations observed near the time of the incident. While these factors matter, they often obscure the more important lesson. The system had been drifting away from its intended operating envelope for a long time. By the time the final failure occurred, recovery was no longer possible, regardless of how competently the situation was handled in the moment. From an engineering perspective, this pattern reveals a fundamental challenge in managing complex systems. Robustness can delay failure, but it can also hide it. Systems designed to absorb variation can continue operating long after they have lost their ability to recover safely. This creates a false sense of security, where continued functionality is mistaken for health. In military aviation, where operational demand is constant and tolerances are wide by necessity, This effect is particularly pronounced. Engines are expected to endure conditions that would ground civilian aircraft, making it even harder to distinguish healthy resilience from dangerous adaptation. Organizational structures can unintentionally reinforce this problem. Readiness metrics prioritize availability, sortie rates, and mission success, not internal margin. Maintenance frameworks are optimized for efficiency and compliance, not for detecting slow drift. Decision makers rely on aggregated data that smooths out anomalies rather than highlighting them. None of these structures are inherently flawed, but together they create an environment where early warning signs are easily overlooked because they do not align with existing categories of concern. The result is a system that fails in a way that feels unpredictable, even though it is governed by entirely predictable processes. When margin is gradually eroded, the exact moment of failure becomes sensitive to small, random influences. A minor weather change, a slightly different power setting, or a marginally higher workload can determine when the system crosses the line. This randomness makes failures appear sudden and inexplicable, reinforcing the belief that they could not have been anticipated. In reality, the outcome was shaped long before the final trigger occurred. Understanding this dynamic requires shifting focus away from dramatic moments and toward quiet ones. The most important decisions are often the least visible. The choice to accept a minor anomaly. The assumption that continued operation implies safety. The reliance on thresholds that define danger too narrowly. These decisions accumulate over time, shaping the conditions under which failure becomes inevitable. By the time the system announces that it can no longer cope, the opportunity to intervene meaningfully has already passed. Military aviation history contains many examples where engines failed, not because of a single catastrophic error, but because of a long chain of reasonable decisions made under uncertainty. Crews followed procedures, maintenance teams did their jobs, and commanders balanced competing demands as best they could. The failure was not caused by incompetence or negligence, but by the inherent difficulty of managing complex systems that change slowly and hide their own deterioration. This is why the first thing that goes wrong matters more than the last. When viewed through this lens, engine failures become less mysterious and more instructive. They demonstrate how systems designed to tolerate stress can become vulnerable precisely because of that tolerance. They show how resilience can delay failure while making it harder to see, and how success in the short term can undermine safety in the long term. Most importantly, they remind us that the absence of visible problems is not evidence that nothing is wrong, only that the system has not yet reached its limit. The lesson is not that military aircraft engines are unreliable or that existing safeguards are ineffective. On the contrary, their ability to operate for long periods under degraded conditions is a testament to their design. The lesson is that the first thing that goes wrong is often too small to trigger concern, too ordinary to attract attention, and too gradual to feel urgent. Yet, it is that first deviation, not the final failure, that determines the outcome. By the time the engine announces its distress, the story has already been written.